100 years ago, on the night of April 15, 1912, after a collision with an iceberg in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the Titanic liner sank, with more than 2,200 people on board. The Titanic is the largest passenger ship of the early 20th century, the second of three twin steamers produced by the British White Star Line. The Titanic's length was 260 meters, width 28 meters, displacement 52,000 tons, height from the waterline to the boat deck 19 meters, distance from the keel to the top of the pipe 55 meters, top speed 23 knots. Journalists compared it in length with 3 city blocks, and in height with an 11-story building. The Titanic had 8 steel decks, located one above the other at a distance of 2.5 to 3.2 meters. To ensure safety, the ship had a double bottom, and its hull was divided by 16 watertight compartments. Watertight bulkheads rose from the second bottom to the deck. The ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, said that even if 4 of the 16 compartments were filled with water, the liner could continue on its way. On May 31, 1911, the Titanic was launched. 10 months later, on April 2, 1912, the Titanic successfully passed sea trials. The crew of the liner under the leadership of Captain Edward John Smith consisted of 885 people. Of these, 66 are members of the deck crew, over 300 are the engine crew, and about 500 service personnel. The team included 2 radio operators. The Titanic also housed a 9-member Harland and Wolff warranty team led by Thomas Andrews to observe, describe and repair any problems with the ship's systems. The ship's orchestra consisted of 8 people, all of them second-class passengers. The Titanic had 762 cabins, which were divided into 3 classes. Seats were provided for 2,566 passengers. Tickets for the liner were available only to very wealthy people. In terms of modern prices, thousands of dollars were paid for a first-class cabin. The interiors of the cabins on decks B and C were made in 11 styles. The third-class passengers on decks E and F were separated from the first and second class by gates located in different parts of the ship. Before the departure of the Titanic on its maiden and last voyages, it was emphasized that 10 millionaires would be on board the ship on the maiden voyage, and gold and jewelry worth hundreds of millions of dollars would be in its safes. On board the liner were American industrialist, heir to mining magnate Benjamin Guggenheim, millionaire John Jacob Astor with his young wife, assistant to U.S. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, Major Archibald Willingham, but U.S. Congressman Isidor Straus, actress Dorothy Gibson, British fashion designer Lucy Christian Duff Gordon, and many other famous and wealthy people of that time. On April 10, 1912, at noon, the Titanic superliner set off on its only journey from Southampton, UK, to New York, USA, with stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland. During the 4 days of the journey, the weather was clear and the sea calm. On April 14, 1912, on the 5th day of the voyage, several ships sent messages about icebergs in the area of the ship's route. For most of the day, the radio was broken, and many messages were not noticed by the radio operators, and the captain did not pay due attention to others. By the evening, the temperature began to drop, reaching 0 Celsius by 2200 hours. At 23 o'clock a.m. message was received from the Californian about the presence of ice, but the Titanic radio operator cut off the radio exchange before the Californian had time to report the coordinates of the area. The telegraph operator was busy sending personal messages from passengers. At 23:39, 2 lookouts noticed an iceberg in front of the liner and reported it by phone to the bridge. The oldest of the officers, William Murdoch, gave the command to the helmsman, left rudder. At 23:40, the Titanic collided with an iceberg in the underwater part of the vessel. Of the 16 watertight compartments of the vessel, 6 were cut through. At midnight on April 15, Titanic designer Thomas Andrews was called to the bridge to assess the severity of the damage. After reporting the incident and inspecting the ship, Andrews informed everyone present that the ship would inevitably sink. On the ship, the bow began to be felt. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be uncovered and the crew and passengers called for evacuation. On the orders of the captain, the radio operators began sending out distress signals, which they transmitted for 2 hours, until the captain relieved the telegraph operators of their duties a few minutes before the ship sank. Distress signals were received by several ships, but they were too far from the Titanic. At 0:25 the coordinates of the Titanic were taken by the ship Carpathia Sia from the crash site at a distance of 58 nautical miles, which was 93 kilometers. Captain of the Carpathia Arthur Rostron ordered to immediately go to the site of the disaster of the Titanic. Rushing to the rescue, the ship was able to reach a record speed of 17.5 knots at the maximum speed for a vessel of 14 knots. For this, Rostron ordered to turn off all appliances that consume electricity and heating. At 1:30 the Titanic operator telegraphed, "We are dropping passengers into small boats." By order of Captain Smith, his assistant, Charles Lightoller, who led the rescue of people on the port side of the liner, put only women and children in the boats. The men, according to the captain, were to remain on deck until all the women got into the boats. First Mate William Murdoch on the starboard side allowed men to load if there were no women and children in line for passengers on deck. At about 2:15, the Titanic's bow sank sharply, the ship moved significantly forward, and a huge wave swept across the decks, sweeping many passengers overboard. The Titanic sank at about 2:20 minutes. At about 4 a.m., about 3.5 hours after receiving the distress call, the Carpathia arrived at the Titanic crash site. The vessel took on board 712 passengers and crew members of the Titanic, after which it safely arrived in New York. Among those rescued were 189 crew members, 129 male passengers, and 394 women and children. The death toll, according to various sources, ranged from 1,400 to 1,517 people. According to official data, after the disaster, 60% of first-class cabins were able to escape, 44% of second-class cabins, 25% of third-class cabins. The last surviving passenger of the Titanic, Milvina Dean, who was traveling aboard the ship at the age of 9 weeks, died on May 31, 2009 at 97 years old. The woman's ashes were scattered over the sea from the pier in the port of Southampton, from where the Titanic set sail in 1912.